All right, I think we finally have our cue to begin. So I'm going to welcome all of you once again to the third edition of Tackling Insurgent Ideologies. We normally do this conference in the summer. We've been doing this, like I said, the third edition. We've been doing it to talk about the spread of radicalization, violent extremism, and what we can as a whole of society do to counter some of these trends. We decided to go ahead with our conference in a truncated form online this year, keeping in mind the pandemic. And in fact, the pandemic also gave us the backdrop against which to have some of these conversations, because we've been seeing various drivers of what kind of social and political violence, ideological violence we're seeing, sort of come from the kind of climate we're living in today as well. Just to give everybody a heads up, we have 40 panelists across 8 panels today and tomorrow from 12 nationalities and 13 countries. So we're quite proud to have actually pulled this off in these circumstances. We'd also like to thank our partners from major tech platforms, Facebook, Twitter, Hewlett Foundation, the UN Counterterrorism Enforcement Directorate is a knowledge partner as well. So we thank them for their support. And without further ado, I'd like to actually go on to the first panel. And we thought that this would be the sort of big picture panel to set the conversations going over the next few sessions. It's titled Tackling the Corona Infodemic. Our speakers are Professor Ali Khan Mahmoodabad from Ashoka University, where he teaches political science and history, a colleague of mine. Mahima Kaur, who's the Public Policy Director of Twitter India. Thank you, Mahima. You're certainly in the firing line of this conversation as well. Rema Rajeshwari, Senior Police Officer from the IPS in Telangana, who has really taken the fight against misinformation and disinformation to the root. And Yevhen Fedchenko, extremely honored to have you join us. You're the co-founder and chief editor of StopFake.org, based in the Ukraine. You're a leading expert on Russian disinformation campaigns, and I'm sure as we're looking at the US elections in a few months from now, there's a lot of attention on you as well and your work that you're doing. So thank you all very much for being here. Let me actually start with you, Mahima, this conversation, because one of the ways in which we're seeing rumor, conspiracy theory, ideological strong positioning spread is through people's social media accounts. And I know that tech platforms have been doing their very best to counter this kind of material as it comes online. But maybe you could sort of lay the landscape for us and walk us through some of the challenges while combating terrorism and violent extremism that you have seen specific to the pandemic.
Yeah, thank you, Maya, and hi everyone. Good to be on the panel with you this morning. Let me give the view from here in terms of the view from Twitter, but maybe even other tech companies who may have similar experiences, perhaps not the same, because we are an open platform. So Twitter has a very unique challenge often. And I think the strength of the open platform, is that there's a diversity of voice, but also what happens is that, I would count another strength is that everybody knows what's going on. And so Twitter is a great place to also be able to see what's taking place in society and what people are talking about. Now, as the coronavirus hit us, similar to what people were experiencing and governments were experiencing, just shutting down physical locations, the same was happening over here for tech companies as well, right? Suddenly our offices around the world were closing down, and we were scrambling as well to figure out how to do this entire operation from work from home. One of the first things I had to do in India was write to the police commissioner in Bangalore, because we had to keep the office open, and it's an essential service because it was a primary mode of crisis communication. At this time, you see a lot of people suddenly go indoors and they spending a lot more time online. So you see a surge of digital users. This has been told to me by many people in terms of not just, say, Twitter saw a rise, which of course we did, but a lot of people went straight from the 2G to the 4G because now they're at home and they just needed more data and better internet connection. So you see an actual evolution in terms of people using digital and how much more central to their lives it's become. For the first time, traditionally Twitter has been of the view that we are not the arbiters of truth, and we do, we do content moderation around the Twitter rules, but it's very difficult for a private platform to actually take a call on whether something is true or not. But given the coronavirus pandemic, and there was so much medical misinformation all over the place, we actually did, update our rules to take into account a lot of the medical misinformation and also the targeting of certain communities as relating to the spread of the virus and the damage, the offline damage that could do. So I think that was one of the directions in which we went. In India, because you have so many fact checkers and you have certified fact checkers, we actually had an events page, which is basically in your Explore tab. It was like right on top where people could go and they could click on it and they could see a feed of fact checks by about 8 to 9, I think, fact checkers in multiple languages. So it's a great feed to actually go and see like the kinds of fact checks taking place in India, one place where you can see all different organizations and what they're looking at. This was again around the coronavirus. A couple of other things that we did from a platform perspective is, you want to just direct people to like the most accurate information they can get. And so a lot of the search prompts, when people are searching for particular words around the coronavirus and, other terms around it, we were making sure that it was coming back to authoritative sources, which may have been the WHO or the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. And so there were, product and policy updates that we had to do at a time where we were rejigging ourselves to make sure that people were redirected to accurate information and that we were able to take down more content that was harmful at a time like this. So I'll leave it at that, and then we can kind of talk about other issues as well.
Right, Mahima, thanks very much for sort of laying out that landscape. And in fact, that's one of the interesting things of these times that we're in, where we've seen a significant amount of conspiracy. I mean, we've always talked about how the drivers of radicalization sort of feed off a sense of a perceived enemy, of fear, of grievance, and things like that. What those enemies might be in the violent actors' milieu, I think, is what's open to question. But before I come to Ali and Yev and Rema, let me bring you in here, because in a conversation sometime in June, I remember you made a very interesting comment about, you're smiling already, about misinformation and radicalization being Siamese twins. And in the current climate where you fight the sort of misinformation in your own district, where rumor mongering has led to all kinds of bad actions, what's your take on how the pandemic is feeding into violence, how it's feeding into radicalization, and what law enforcement really can do from your perspective?
Well, thank you, Maya, and good morning, everybody. I'm really good to be here, sharing this panel with people whom I really look up to. Well, as we speak, a sizable number of police officers from my team are in home isolation after testing positive for COVID-19. So I thought I would start the discussions by sharing a small story about how COVID-19 infodemic impacts, or rather affects, individuals at a much deeper level. And once I share the story quite briefly, then I'll move on to the question that you just posed. Yesterday I got a call from an officer of the rank of head constable. He's part of my team. He made a video call to me and he was crying on call and he was clearly panicking. He tested positive and he was advised home isolation by the doctors because he was a case of mild asymptomatic. He had no symptoms. He was absolutely fine. He called me up and he said, "Ma'am, I don't want to be home. I don't want to go to the hospital. I'm going to die. Please take care of my wife and children." I tried my level best to calm him down, and I kept telling him that, how we are taking care of a huge number of police officers who are in home isolation, how we are offering the best home care. And I also gave him the details about the number of police officers who defeated COVID-19 and joined back to duty. But he wasn't convinced. He went on and he kept telling me that, "Ma'am, I don't think I'm going to live. Even doctors are dying. Only this morning, Dr. Aisha died. And she was so young, and I saw the pictures, and even doctors are not able to protect themselves from this virus, and I don't think, I'm going to survive." So I asked him who Dr. Aisha was, because I had clearly no idea about this particular doctor. He said he saw something in his Facebook feed and also in some of the WhatsApp groups about this particular video and some images about this very young doctor from Kamareddy district of Telangana who died of COVID. So he kept telling me that, no, I'm not going to survive. Well, I've been away from social media for some time, so I clearly missed out on the Dr. Aisha story. So I went back and I checked. Well, a classic case of echo chamber effect. The viral selfie of Dr. Aisha, identified as a young doctor who succumbed to COVID-19, had been circulating in social media for the past few weeks. And I think this was a hot trending topic on the 2nd of August, which was Sunday. Many celebrities, including the ones with verified handles, tweeted, retweeted, and it was widely shared by thousands of internet users. And fortunately, by then, I think by yesterday or the day before, some of the fact checkers have debunked the story, and turns out that the image which was being circulated as that of Dr. Aisha has been in circulation since 2017. It was probably lifted from one of the websites, and some website on dental clinic, and many websites have used this story. Turned out to be a fake story. The moral of the story here is that how viral misinformation or unverified content plays with the public perception. Here I'm talking about this one small example of an officer from my own team. In spite of my assurances, my promises, giving him examples of how we take care of them, how the administration has come up with such a great medical infrastructure to take care of the COVID positive patients, he was not ready to believe me. I'm his boss, and I've been taking care of him since 4 months. But he didn't want to believe me because he has seen so much feeds in the social media platforms that he almost believed that he was going to die. So this definitely, social media definitely plays a huge role in public perception of critical healthcare infrastructure, and especially during a crisis like this, it is very important. And I don't think we can afford to have an unregulated digital space which will put lives in danger. And the answer to your question, Maya, I thought I will answer that in detail during the course of the webinar. To put it simply, like I always said, that they are Siamese twins. They are inseparable. Let me just give one small example, and with that I'll end this part of my conversation. See, if you look at how radicalization happened in the past, traditionally, if you have read about radicalization, extremist organizations had to put in so much efforts. It wasn't easy to reach out to people and radicalize them. Now, with social media and internet, it has become much more easier. The process has become way too simplified, and it's pretty quick. And you look at the case of the lone wolves attacks, of ISIS. Who is radicalizing them? It's like an online community, and people are radicalizing themselves. There's a lot of mutual radicalization happening there. And radicalization cannot survive on the plank of truth. You need to have unverified information. You need to have half-truths. Without half-truths, there's no way anybody can be radicalized. You tell somebody the truth, he's going to apply his rationality, and he may never become a radicalized individual. So that's the connection between radicalization and misinformation. I'm sure we can talk in detail about this in the course of the webinar.
Yeah, and I think before I move to Yevhen, let me just bring Ali Khan into this. Ali, the last point that Rema has made, which is about how if there is truth, then and if there's access to verified, honest, truthful information, the danger of radicalization is mitigated somehow. But you've written a very strong piece in the edits that we've also just released about the reality and the truth of the environment that we're living in, and how there are deep divisions, polarizing divisions along the lines of religion, along the lines of community, culture, that they're not fake. Those divisions exist. So how do you square off the reality of that truth with what Rema says about how truth does not, cannot radicalize?
Right. I mean, so thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure to meet you all virtually, and hopefully in the real world soon. So here's a few things to think about. I really appreciated Mahima's comments and Remaji's comments. One of the important things to keep in mind is conspiracies have been around for thousands of years, right? Previous pandemics, the Black Plague, previous wars have been blamed, for example, on Jews, anti-Semitism. Again, during the coronavirus, anti-Semitism has gone up across the world. Minority groups are blamed. In America, the Boogaloo movement is blaming African Americans. In India, the minority communities which are being blamed, religious communities, ethnic communities. So this is not as a phenomenon new, right? And in a sense, it's part of human nature. It's partly to do with how people perceive themselves, their social, political, economic stake that they have in society. And of course, apart from ideology, belief, or the ease of access, as Rima was saying, radicalizing people, the larger factors are that if people begin to lose those stakes in society, they begin to look for alternative ways to express themselves. Sometimes this manifests itself in the form of violence. So, the first and most important thing, and I think something that the social media companies probably won't be happy to hear about, neither will libertarians who want a free internet, is that, look, we had the social media, whether it's Facebook, whether it's Twitter, whether it's Instagram and various other platforms, they need some kind of regulation by the government, right? Because these are now, much like newspapers had regulation, right? There was a broad legal framework within which you were accountable, and you had to be, you cannot simply say that we are not arbiters of the truth. We are just providing, the role of a facilitator in the attention economy. I mean, these are big businesses, right? As we remember, you and I, all of us sitting here, remember that when the traditional media got taken over by big business houses, that affected the journalism, because of course, who owns a particular entity affects what they are going to be doing in terms of policy within that company. And you see the rise of Fox News, you see the rise of The Sun, and so on and so forth. The same thing is happening, except on a much more massive scale online. So at one level, there has to be very, very close, there has to be firstly a conversation between specialists, policymakers, academics, philosophers, law enforcement agents, about actually how to conceive of the law around this issue. This is this is throwing up, in a sense, an entirely new set of problems that are hitherto unfaced, right? For the last 2,000 years, ever since Plato's Republic, 2,500 years, we've been dealing with manifestations, gradual incremental changes, but suddenly, in the last 20 years, we are dealing with an entirely new virtual reality, right? And our lives as individuals are a seamless blend between these two worlds. So, very basic things are undergoing profound changes. What does autonomy mean? What does freedom mean? What is freedom of choice, right? When algorithms and the manner in which they operate are determining what you see on your screen in terms of ads and so on and so forth. So in this entirely new ecosystem, one of the most important things I think for us to keep in mind is that ultimately social media, of course, is a medium, and that medium needs some kind of regulation, but we should not forget that the problems are actually problems which emanate from very real world issues, right? In India, we saw, for example, at the beginning of the pandemic, certain, the Tablighis, which kind of sort of seamlessly became Muslims in general, being blamed for being super spreaders, etc., etc. Around the same time, there were many other religious communities that were having, big meetings. This is a result of the real political changes that have been taking place in India over the past few decades, right? So social media, of course, is a way of monitoring, of perhaps keeping an eye on who the main players are, how people's voices are getting amplified. But the conversation should not forget the grassroots realities, in my opinion. It's very easy for the social media companies themselves to say, well, look, we are only involved in providing this platform. We're part of the attention economy. In a sense, we're making money from people's attentions. These, of course, our attention now is the most valuable product, right? So philosophically speaking, it makes sense that radicalization, extremism, or conspiracy theories increase in a time such as this because, in a sense, the world becomes more black and white in the online world. So it's not just extremists, but you and I, on Twitter, on Facebook, the way we react, we have a very small space to react in. Psychologically, this changes the manner in which we might otherwise behave with each other. So these are very serious conversations, and I fear that by just simply avoiding the tougher conversation about how political actors, about how non-state actors, about how organizations are affecting real changes in the world and amplifying them using social media, and therefore, gaining traction because of it, we have to keep that reality into account. And if we don't, right. I fear it's just a matter of policing, flagging posts, flagging content, and at some point, whether it's through concerns of privacy or legal concerns, there has to be, social media is not going to be a watchdog for itself.
Right.
If we believe in constitution. Sorry, just the last point. If we believe in a constitutional framework, then we have to have laws and legal frameworks within which the social media company is an actor. Although we're living in a highly globalized world, nation states is still a reality. Each nation state has its own particular set of problems. And so we do need to respond. There needs to be more synergy in academia, media, social media, policy.
And I think the intersectionality really between all these various aspects that you're talking about is something that we're trying to kind of cut through over here. I'm going to ask Yevhen the next question, but before I do that, I would like to tell all the people who are attending this webinar, there is a little tab at the bottom of your screen where you can actually type in your name and a question. So if you have a question for any of our panelists, do put them in there. They will come to us and we'll take the questions from there. Yevhen, the point that Ali has made about our political climate and political actors that are manifestly engaging in misinformation or disinformation or computational propaganda campaigns themselves. The world started talking about it after the 2016 US election. We're seeing another election now 2 months down the road. We in India were saying that, welcome to the conversation because we've been having it for a few years before the Americans caught up. But you have actually really aggressively worked on who these actors are and how they spread, and they feed on conspiracy theory, they feed on this idea of fear and grievance, and we're seeing actual violence. We're seeing enemies being created out of nothing, out of communities that have been disenfranchised. Ali pointed out minorities across the world that are feeling the heat of these kinds of conspiracy theories, whether they're immigrants, whether they're Muslims in India, whether they are, Black Americans in the United States. And we're seeing this kind of feeding of fear and feeding, therefore, of violence. So you're having the conversation in the virtual world and you're seeing the violence in the real world. Now, regulation is a tricky space. But, what are your thoughts on all this?
Thank you so much, first of all, for bringing me into this conversation. And so I represent here StopFake, which is a fact-checking organization. And for us, as well as you said, this problem did not arise 2 years ago or 3 years ago because we've been battling disinformation for 6 years already. Within the context of Russia's war against Ukraine. And as most my co-panelists were mentioning, non-state actors from Ukrainian perspective, a state actor, Russia is one of the biggest perpetrators that want to use this information, this opportunity with COVID to bring more chaos and uncertainty to to the conversation. And if we talk about violence in Ukraine's case, it's not only violence between communities or against minorities, it's actually a large-scale war where disinformation and misinformation is not only opportunistically used, but also is created on a purpose to contribute more to this war. And I would give you just one example. This year we celebrate 40th anniversary of so-called Operation Infection, when Soviet Union implanted a story into Indian press about HIV/AIDS being invented by Pentagon as a biological weapon. And this is a great example because now we see how COVID is also weaponized by different states, including Russia, and they want to use it as additional leverage to get more geopolitical influence over Ukraine, but not only limited to. For example, we can look at the very similar topic as this AIDS story. They now push the same story that COVID was developed in Pentagon biological laboratories in Ukraine and in Georgia. And it's not only a marginal conversation, it's really become a mainstream within Russian media and some pro-Russian media in Ukraine and in Georgia. And they are seriously discussing that COVID was really invented as a biological weapon. Also, as fact-checkers and a third-party fact checker for Facebook, we have found a lot of harmful content which was deliberately created to use again to create more uncertainty and create more chaos for different groups of people. We have seen all types of conspiracy theories, like COVID was developed by Bill Gates and Soros, and it's enhanced by the use of 5G connection and other things. So the purpose of all this is to make people basically disbelieve in what they used to believe, to prove that we see more and more states becoming failed states because governments cannot cope with COVID and cannot deliver to people basic information about it, basic treatment and other things. And so this basically creates a good infrastructure to disrupt whole countries and governments from within, and this is very dangerous. Also, we've seen when governments, Russian governments or Chinese governments, were using COVID as a public relations event when they've been delivering some small aid to other countries like Italy, and they've been saying, look, European Union was doing nothing for you people in Italy, but here Russia comes and deliver you to help you and other things, which also again works to disrupt European Union from within and to get some geopolitical gains in all this. So for us as fact checkers, it's important not only to monitor this and do the fact checking, but also to stop this harmful content to being delivered to people, because that creates a huge backdrop for the way how people start to perceive the whole situation, and that creates very kind of dangerous modus operandi when people are listening to marginal voices, and then at some point those marginal voices are starting to move from the fringes to become a mainstream, and this is very dangerous from political point of view.
Right. I think, Mahima, let me just bring that back to you, because, everyone's raised some very valid points. And the issue really is that, while we can talk about and skirt around, the need to balance regulation and freedom of speech and not be an arbiter and things like that, I think the conversation has accelerated, or the climate has possibly accelerated against the backdrop of pandemic. So you don't necessarily have only conspiracies about specific minorities or immigrants, or in the case of India, Muslims. We saw, a hashtag like Corona Jihad, for example, just take over the social media feeds, and it was obviously incumbent on all of you to bring it down. Now, that's one part of it, but there are also conspiracies about big data and what it's doing to our lives. There's big pharma, and as Yevhen pointed out, the conspiracy around the genesis of COVID itself and how that is playing into the hands of violent actors or bad actors and state and non-state. We forget just the public. We've actually seen, political leaders take advantage of a pandemic to push through policy. We saw Viktor Orban do that, for example, in Hungary. We're seeing the public willingly surrender certain individual freedoms because there needs to be some kind of monitoring of what's going on in terms of the spread of the pandemic. So there are lots of little factors that are kind of coming into this larger cauldron right now. And those challenges are particularly there for tech companies to manage.
Yeah, no, it is a challenge. I think the growth of social media has been, not just social media, I would say digital, has been pushed, as a fundamental piece of, governance and citizenry. And it has really gone into everyone's phones. The internet has become more affordable as the years have gone by. So as more people have access, you're also seeing the proliferation of these problems, right? Like if we had this conference like 3-4 years ago, the problems are a little bit smaller, but the size and the dimension kind of opens up. Now, just going back to Ali's point, I know it's common thinking, and I understand, why this is the case, that, a lot of people think that social media companies would actually benefit a lot from like a very radical atmosphere, completely polarized, just conspiracy theories running loose and wild. And this is like, the attention economy that like social media companies will thrive on. So I can't speak for others, but I can tell you about Twitter, right? A couple of years ago, for example, we found that the platform was used a lot by ISIS, right? And there were, if you remember, like surge back into your memory right now, and you can remember that there was a big conversation about how ISIS was using Twitter. That conversation is gone because Twitter actually took on the issue of ISIS accounts and basically was able to solve to a large extent, the proliferation of these ISIS accounts and propaganda accounts. And now we have researchers who are doing studies and saying it's negligible, it's non-existent. So it's not a case that things don't move. It's not a case that there is, when you look at a platform like this, like you yourself will say to me, why should I be here? Like, why should I be here? It doesn't make sense for a Twitter because we don't believe in this fundamentally. It doesn't make sense for the business because brands don't want to be next to this kind of content anymore. They don't want to advertise next to this content. And fundamentally, you believe that you're a platform that gives a voice to people and speaks to power. So when that is in your DNA, then you do have to solve this problem which you mentioned, right? Like you are an open platform and people are using you from all walks of life. Now, we can't obviously divorce the offline from the online. And there are obviously factors offline that exacerbate the online. But I can only speak to say what a Twitter does. Like, if you look at what we have done in terms of cross-industry collaboration, the GIFCP, for example, is something that was started as a voluntary sort of association of organizations who would talk to each other around terrorist incidents. That has been turned into a full-fledged non-profit with its own executive director, with civil society partners and academics and experts coming in and giving sort of that kind of feedback that would inform our policies. If you look at not just terrorism, right? Like when you look at like content takedown, and you look at like the early version of what we were talking about, it was all related to terrorism, and you could identify the actors that you're talking about, say, for example, ISIS. Now you moved into a place, where you have different problems in different countries. Like we're just hearing about Russia and Ukraine and what the conversation there is. Some of it completely new to us because India is always talking about India and our problems here, right? But this is happening across different geographies. And so you need to have a principle-based approach in terms of the policies that you come up with so that you can take down the maximum content which is harmful and it leads to offline harm or it's damaging in some way. So I think the approach is really that whether it's a violent extremist group, whether it's a terrorist organization, whether it's a non-state actor, and we're able to track that through the way they use bots and they proliferate, accounts, it should be principle-based because we understand what we're trying to take down so that it's not ad hoc. I mean, very simply put, content takedown can be seen very political based on what you're taking down. If you don't have a principle around which you're taking it down, then it just seems very arbitrary. So what we strive for is to come up with principle-based policies so that we can take down the maximum amount of content. Having said that, back to the point that you raised, and I'll just reiterate, content takedown is only one part of the whole story. You can keep taking down content, you can keep closing accounts, you can keep doing that. But if fundamentally people don't believe in that truth, right? If you don't believe, if you remember Bangalore, it was 5 SMSs a day and still people were rushing to train stations. Like, if you are not able to convince people of a truth, right, that's where the problem remains. You can shut down different platforms, but that doubt is there. So one of the things that the government, for example, did was they started with us on Twitter, COVID Seva, which is like a 24/7 handle that, you know, answers people's doubts around coronavirus. That's the kind of thing that you need from day one, I think. So that if people have rumors that they're hearing of, if they are like mildly critical in their approach to the information that they're getting, but they want to go somewhere and just find out for sure, they know the fact-checking websites exist, but they can also go to, say, Twitter handles across platforms to ask that question. So I think part of it is there is an offline world. That is a reality. I think that's something that others can speak for. But from our perspective, you have to really look at it very structurally. What does your platform do? What are the things you can implement? What are the kind of cross-industry, cross collaborations that you can be part of to actually stem this in the volume and the speed that is taking place? And so I think that's the way we're approaching this issue.
Let me just take that to Ali for a quick minute. Ali, this idea that, you know, content moderation is not the full answer. So, you know, and regulation can be tricky because regulation can also play into the hands of political actors, you know, and particular ideologies. So it can be a good thing and a bad thing. And how is anyone expected to strike that balance if there is a regulatory framework that you're talking about? What is it that you'd like to see?
Well, I mean, regulatory framework is, of course, a kind of placing limits or creating a framework. So 2 points. One, to speak to Maima's point about ISIS. So, you know, as far as ISIS is concerned, there's a kind of global consensus across the board that this is a terrorist organization, right? And so it's very easy to build consensus. And Brookings did a report with Twitter on this, where they mapped ISIS supporters, you know, how they were operating. It was an interesting report, and of course, Twitter cooperated with the Brookings Institute as far as that's concerned. But the point is actually a lot of the radicalism or the extremism that we are seeing has been mainstreamed, right? There is no consensus on that. Whether it's in India, whether it's in America, whether it's in parts of the Middle East or in Europe, in Ukraine or in the Crimea and so on. These are mainstream political opinions, right? Which goes back to my last point that, of course, as I was saying also, that the real world issues still matter a great deal. In my opinion, one big thing that I feel both social media companies as well as political parties can do is to actually, if you think about it, most of us and the generation that is growing up now in the last 15 years, they know how to use one of these devices by simply obtaining it and then figuring it out, right? There are some countries in Northern Europe where they're introducing the world of the internet as a part of your school curriculum. And I think this is something to build on, which is very important because, you know, we are taught how to look at the world. We are taught how, you know, we are given a kind of rightly or wrongly a view of history and so on and so forth. It's now more important than ever that the generation that is growing up is actually taught by in their private or public schools about what this beast is, which is called the internet, right? I mean, you know, we quite literally now hold infinity in the palm of our hand. You know, I am a scholar on virtually everything because of Sheikh Google or, you know, Ayatollah Wikipedia. So, or Yogi YouTube, if you like. But the point is that there has to be that incorporation of how to be in the online world, right? My virtual identity. So a lot, I think this is going to obviously play out over the next few decades because essentially we are all part of a gigantic kind of guinea pig experiment because we are dealing with industrial size persuasion. I mean, I'm with all due respect to Mahima, it is a fact, and there have been enough studies about this. The Oxford Center for the Internet is writing about this. You know, this book, for instance, by James William, which is I would recommend to all of you and to anyone who's watching this this panel. It's a philosophical changes that we're witnessing in our times. These are fundamentally altering our sense of self, right? So there's that deeper conversation to have, but at the same time, we need to have a class introduced. How truthful do you have to be in your virtual identity to your real identity, right? Things like that, small things. Kids will make a profile on Twitter or Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, which is a kind of aspiration of what they hope to be, perhaps. Or it is a dumbed down version or black and white version of what they feel they're facing flack for in the real world. So somewhere, this is only going to be possible through education. And I think regulation, of course, is just to prevent extremism and violence. But the larger changes, in order to be able to create a healthy conversation, and in my opinion, only be done through schooling, through education from a very young age, because now kids as young as 4, 5, 6 are navigating their way around.
That's right. Yevhen, let me actually come back to you with some of these points as well, because one of the questions we've also had from our people who are watching and tuning in is that, we can't only restrict our conversation and what we're saying to violent actors, bad actors, the Boogaloo boys or conspiracy theorists or ISIS, or as Ali pointed out, people around whom there is a consensus that they are a problem, in whether it's in the online space or the real space. What happens when you have governments use the pandemic to further their own political agendas? We're seeing it happening across the globe as well. I'll come back to Rema for a couple of questions, but I want you to come in on this as well, because where do you then identify something as fake, something as government propaganda, something as something that's happening in the real world? How do you manage that?
Yeah, it's a great question, because we see the growing attempts of different governments, including Russia's government, which I already mentioned, to use this whole situation and to weaponize geopolitics and their relations with different countries, or the whole set of countries like European Union or NATO or any other things. And sometimes at the kind of lower level, it's very difficult to define who is behind this malign information. Is this activity of some non-state actor? This is a grassroots activity, or it's fueled from outside, or this is fueled by some government? I would give you a very simple example. We've been talking about a kind of big geopolitics, ISIS and other things, but when we've been doing the fact-checking on COVID, we have found that at the very beginning of the pandemic, the growing number of people started to post something like lemons are the cure for COVID, and they started to seriously discuss it. And then we've seen the whole sect, growing around this. And this is all about kind of educated people, which has access to any kind of information, to peer-reviewed medical journals and other things. But they've been very seriously discussing this lemon treatment, and this is gives you the idea that you can have access to as much information as you can imagine. You have thousands of years of accumulation of scientific knowledge, but then people definitely would start to look for something very simple, or I would rather say simplistic, because they really need to get very quick answers to their anxiety. And those who would provide those quickest and simplest explanations to what is happening would win the attention of this audience. So this is kind of a paradox we've been dealing with. And another paradox is that there is a kind of always the first wave when people see the danger and they mobilized against it. It was the case with the Russia's war against Ukraine, when people mobilized at the very beginning and said, oh yeah, we realize there is a lot of Russian disinformation, so we need to be very, very careful with what we consume and from where we consume. And then some years passed and people started to relax. And the same things happened to COVID, because at the very beginning we've seen the growing kind of alarm and people started to sort out information and try to understand what is right and what is wrong. And then this barrier was lowering and lowering. And again, why it was happening? Because of the influx of this disinformation and misinformation, which drastically lowers the barrier to the people critical perception of reality. And that's exactly the leverage many governments want to to use. So they throw more and more disinformation to the fan to make sure that people stop understanding what is happening around them. They would stop their critical thinking. They would lower their barrier for perception of this. And then it opens a lot of new opportunities to manipulate those people.
Rima, let me just bring all this to you, because one of the challenges for you as law enforcement is what to do when you encounter, potentially dangerous information or speech, whether it's in the nature of a threat, whether it's in the nature of an idea, whether it's in the nature of incitement. How do you deal with the person who has posted this kind of content, and how do you engage both at the community as well as at the law enforcement level? I mean, how do you deal with these platforms when you need access to certain individuals or certain accounts? I mean, I think one of the questions we've had is really how you can show the local communities the dangers of the interactions that they might be encountering.
Well, let me answer that in two parts. In the first part, let me just give an example from my line of work. It's been 10 years, and if there is one thing that I can comfortably say that has tremendously changed in the way we plan policing interventions on ground, is the fact that of late, every time we plan for a security management or a major bandobast or law and order management, it happens in both the physical space and also the digital space. A very small example from what just happened in the last 2 weeks. We had a major festival last week. We had Bakri, and tomorrow we are going to plan a major security bandobast for the Ayodhya Pujan. And in both the cases, when I plan my bandobast, my security management, the first thing we do is to plan for the digital space. I activate my social media monitoring cell. The first task is to monitor social media, and from there we move on to the physical space, because these days every clash, be it a clash which originates out of a malicious content which was probably shared in the local platforms in a community, the starting point is always in the digital space. So things have changed a lot, and the way we tell the community or probably educate the community that this is also equally important for us to keep peace and order in that community is by reaching out to them. There's no two way about it. You reach out to the community. Every time you conduct a peace committee meeting, you convince them of the fact that it is so important for you to tell the members of your community or the youth groups or the different groups that operate in that particular area not to resort to circulation of baseless information in social media, right around these festivals are in the corner. And the second part is it's much more at the platform. I mean, it's at the platform side. Well, if you look at the original intent of internet, or rather social media platforms, the intent was to have an open and democratic source of information and a space where everybody could freely express their views and share knowledge and have a discussion. But we've seen that that's not the case always. That's not the case. I mean, if you have studied social media platforms and how the whole attention economy works, I was really glad Ali brought this phrase up, because this really needs a lot of attention. And we are still in the process of equipping ourselves to understand how the attention economy works and how it probably transforms itself to a very disturbing situation on ground. You look at how the attention economy works, you understand that algorithms most often steer us towards articles and posts that reflect our own ideological preferences, belief sets. And I've personally seen that the search results usually echo what you already believe or what you already know or you like. I mean, I go to Facebook and I feel like today, if I ended up reading an article about Russian misinformation, for the next 10 days, I can see that there are so many articles which just comes up. I've never went to those websites, but they just come up. And this is how it works. So I do think that it is equally important for the platforms to have certain amount of accountability to work on content moderation. I do understand and I do agree that content moderation is not everything, but it is a very, very crucial aspect of ensuring safety and maintain peace in the society.
Right, so there is a question actually following that for both Ali and Yevhen, but let me take that to you first, Yevhen, because one of our participants, Nishant Agarwal, is asking, how do you think we draw a line between freedom of speech and expression and legitimate social media regulation? Once again, this is sort of really at the heart of this entire conversation, because if we're looking at the mainstreaming of this kind of information and this kind of information vehicle, then just like the mainstream encountered certain regulations, how do we do this?
Yeah, this is actually a great question, because on one hand, social media are probably the greatest platform to demonstrate freedom of speech. And on another hand, this is a perfect platform to usurpate freedom of speech, and not by social media themselves, but by those who wants to exploit the opportunities which social media provides. So very often we hear that social media are blamed for this, but actually we need to look who is actually trying to play social media. And again, here we come to state and non-state actors which understand that social media can be perfectly weaponized. And in Ukrainian case, it was absolutely a story. So if you cannot use television, you can then try to use social media to deliver disinformation masqueraded as a real information. And so there's a line between freedom of speech and usurpation of freedom of speech, and basically the fight against democracy using the democratic the most democratic platforms as social media are, is very, very kind of a thin line between them. And from our point of view, fact-checking delivers a lot, because we started to do fact-checking for Facebook since March, and we see great results for that, because previously we could only monitor what is happening over there, but now we can downplay the importance of those messages which are not true, and we can also influence the monetizing side of this. And this is very important for those media that tried to deliver those pieces of fake disinformation. So they are now contacting us back and saying, oh, what we can do to make this information more visible again. And this is important because they realize that there is a leverage how someone can influence what they publish and how true this information is. And that's the way how we made a lot of publishers to change the information, to make improvements to that, to make it more truthful and more trustworthy. So basically you can do some important things even without regulating those things. But on the other hand, we see again, if we would come back to state actors, they want to use a regulation of social media for their political purposes. So now we see how Russian government is trying to regulate Facebook and Twitter and Google, not because they want them to be more important in a truth-finding process, but just because they want to be a main stakeholder in this, and they want to control the all information which is coming through those platforms. And this is again, so they use the clause of freedom of speech for absolutely anti-democratic intentions, and so we definitely should separate those two things, because in some cases you really need to understand that they use the instruments of freedom of speech to fight democracy and freedom of speech, and at some point they might win in this if that would be allowed to go on without some limitations.
Right. So, I mean, I think, Ali, this is the democratic backslide that a lot of political scientists like you are also talking about, where the tools of democracy, the tools of liberal democracy and the dissemination of information are being used by bad actors. And we've got questions from someone named Rahul Yadav as well on how to deal with either political groups or extremist groups who promote their own agenda on social media. Now, you know, one part of it is the tech problem, and we'll get Mahima to come in on that again before we end. But one part of it is actually the political landscape that we're all in. We're seeing political actors, political parties fuel their own agendas based on identity. We're seeing it happen here, and we're seeing the divide sort of deepen further. So, when we talk about regulation, how do you regulate the regulator?
Look, so I mean, I think this again, going back to my earlier point, has no easy solution apart from a sustained conversation about this space, which is called the internet or social media, and around concepts which animate our political landscape. And this requires education. There's no, look, I mean, democracy in itself is not a value, right? This is the biggest illusion that is used, right? Oh, it's democratic. I mean, that in itself has no meaning. And if you look at all the philosophers from across the ideological spectrum, being a citizen requires being skilled as a citizen, having the tools to understand your role as a citizen, right? Similarly, we need to have the tools to understand our role online, our individual presence. So this is a much larger conversation, I think, that goes beyond just social media, because, we are seeing in the last 30 years across the world the kind of consensus which is the dismantling of Fukuyama's end of history and the resurgence of identity politics across the world, right? Yeah. These are things that are reflecting ground realities, and as it happens, this is the period in which the internet also has taken root and social media has spread, and so it's in a way responding to these grassroots realities. In a country like India, where even formal education does not necessarily translate into a more educated mind, it's inevitable that a smartphone or a Twitter social media account Facebook is going to be different. And it's going to reduce that person to one dimension of their identity. So there's a very large conversation to be had. Maybe you guys can start it. I'm sure others will be a willing part of it, which actually sits down and thinks about how to reimagine our public comments, right? Habermas wrote famously about the public sphere in Europe over 300 years. The social media is now part of our public sphere. We need to have a digital Athens, a digital commons, a space in which we can actually, where those, responsible actors, whether they're academics or people from social media or from policy people like Yevon, create a digital commons which educate, right? And this is, I think, a very long-term thing. In the meanwhile, we regulate, we police, we try and perhaps have creative ways of trying to track down extremist speech. I mean, Twitter, I'm sure, has this problem. Facebook has this problem. A lot of the extremist speech, the abusive speech, the violent speech in India is a local language in English script, right? So English, for instance, where there's no set spelling for any one abusive word. So it's very hard for an algorithm, and of course it's impossible for a human being to check that. Eventually, I think this will only be fixed through education and sensitization that occurs outside the social media space. And perhaps you can, Facebook or Twitter can have identified people who have thought about this. People like James Williams, people like this guy, and promote him, right? Promote people like him to catalyze a simple conversation, to force people to think about, what they're doing in the online world. And I'm sure people will be interested.
That's a good point that Ali has made to sort of leave the conversation on as well. And the fact is, we're seeing, as we were planning this this panel, we were seeing hearings on Capitol Hill where the top tech CEOs and management are being faced with tough congressional questions. We're seeing the debate really take on a different proportion in the United States as the election campaign heats up and approaches. But I think the questions that people have for tech companies, for companies like Facebook and Twitter, are these about the way the public sphere has been shaped, the digital public sphere that we all inhabit today. the questions of attention, the questions of not having binary and reductive conversations, but being allowed space for a little bit of thought, the constant need for speed. What are platforms themselves going to do to sort of partly fix the problem that many say they've created?
Is this for me?
That's right, Mahima.
Yeah, I thought it sounded like it was for me. Yeah, Maya, I think part of what we're seeing right now is we need to, we are dealing with a lot of new issues and issues that are becoming very big, and they need to be studied with very thoughtful responses. So I can only sort of answer from a point of work done and work still being done, right? And work being evaluated. So to Ali's point, Twitter, as a company has something called the Trust and Safety Council. In that Trust and Safety Council, which is global in nature, many non-profits are invited to be part of it because they are experts at different things. They're experts at online safety. They're experts is CV. Sorry, I knew Stella had to make an entry at some point. I'm surprised she lasted a whole hour, but that's my dog for most people who know. So we deal with experts, and then experts basically inform us so that we can create policies that basically take into account the kind of problems that we are seeing emerge, or they have suddenly taken over and they are now the dominant problem. I think misinformation was something like that, which sort of slowly started, becoming the talk of the day, and now here we are, discussing it. Other things, you want to study how your platform has been used. Twitter really believes, and even to Kevin's point, we believe in an open internet, right? We don't want the response to be that we start closing out internets across the world and a global conversation is not possible anymore. That's not the outcome that we want to see. I think as a platform, I'm sure most of the speakers here don't want to be there in 5 years, where suddenly we've just gone back in time and it's very difficult to have a global conversation. We believe that openness and transparency is part of the Twitter DNA, for example. So what can we do to further that, right? So there are a couple of things that we do to try and walk the talk. For example, if we find that, there are state-backed sort of operations that have taken place on our platform where we've seen propaganda flow, what we've done is we made those data sets available publicly for researchers so that they can go through it and they can find, evidence of the kind of activities that were done on Twitter that can inform conversations like this going forward. So we're not keeping this knowledge to ourselves, we're actually giving it forward to academics to be able to help inform what we should also do about it in the future. For example, Rema mentioned algorithms, right? If you look at Twitter, you've got that little sparkle icon right on top, and you can choose to actually have content served to you based on what's popular in your network, because some people prefer that. They don't want to read everything. But you can also equally click it so that you get chronological based tweets and you just see everything that comes to you. That's how I do Twitter, right? I see everything that's come to me, but some people just feel like it's too much. They can't make sense of what's going on and they want to basically see a little bit of a ranked timeline. So we leave that to the user, but we don't force that choice down to the user. There are other kinds of things I think that you have to do as a company, looking at the volume and the scale of the program, to get experts, academics, civil society, to deal with governments and the regulation that they might be thinking of, looking at the problems that are today, and also as a product, policies that we are giving to the user so that we are actually giving the kind of choices that need to be given so that people can enjoy this for the productive benefit that it is. And the last one I'll say is I absolutely agree with the dominant thinking over here, which is we are entering a point where digital literacy and understanding has to become part of the curriculum, because this is the reality. I didn't have social media when I was in school. I mean, Facebook came when I was in college and it was nothing, right? By the time I started working in Delhi, that's when social media really started kicking off. But this is a reality for kids today and adults today. So I think the approach has to be from the ground up now, from when you start learning, and that should hopefully also move the needle in the way that we want it to be moved.
Right. I think we'd have to end the conversation on that note because we've gone well over the hour that was assigned to us. Thank you all very much. There's a lot of food for thought. Ali, I know you made that point in our little chat window about how the global conversation is only happening among certain elites. Many of us are sitting on this screen right now as well. But it is limited. I think we take your point. And I know that as I teach media studies, I also teach my own students about the way they need to read the language that's coming their way, tonality is important, the kind of vocabulary you choose is important, the spellings you use are important, and the reach it has in regional languages. I mean, aspiration, who's your target audience, all these things make a difference when you actually go out there and inhabit the digital world. So, the literacy on that point is, I think, well taken. Rema has pointed out challenges of law enforcement, and the real need to deal with bringing down and curbing the rights that certain people are abusing. The rights of those individuals because they're abusing their freedoms. How do we tackle that? Yevhen, thank you so much. I know that your work is going to increase in the next couple of months, and maybe we'll do another session with you closer to November, where you can tell us what's happening on the global landscape. And Ali, I mean, the point that you made about how we need to actually look at the way behavior has changed, political behavior, social behavior has changed with the advent of technology. I think Mahima's point that we were talking about misinformation in a slow and small way a few years ago. At least that has changed. The attention has gone simply from, radicalization and radical violence and terrorism and Islamist terrorism in its sort of minor and minute ways, to expanding that conversation to all kinds of violence, all kinds of bad actors that are now feeding off each other and feeding off the space that the digital world is providing them. So this is by no means a finished conversation. There's a lot of questions we leave our audiences with, but thank you all, Mahima, Rema, Yevhen and Ali, for joining us on this first opening panel, Tackling the Corona Infodemic, for Tackling Insurgent Ideologies this year. Thank you all so much.